welcome to Nazarene Israel. My name is Norman Willis, and I'm the apostle for the restoration of the original first century faith. And in this part 17 of Revelation Simplified, we want to talk about the second war of Gog and Magog. So as we see from the simplified version of the Revelation timeline, first we play out the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 cups. And after these things comes the Battle of Armageddon. This is also the wedding feast we saw. It's in Hosea chapter 2. It's also the first war of Gog and Magog, which is in Ezekiel chapter 39. So one of the things near the end of Ezekiel chapter 39, there are several verses which indicate that this comes prior to the ingathering and then prior to the 1,000-year reign from the land of Israel, which is commonly called the millennium. But then after the millennium is done, there is a second war of Gog and Magog in Ezekiel chapter 38, and we're going to get into that in the second part of this presentation. But the second war of Gog and Magog is not the end of Earth's history. As we saw, it's inherent in the prophetic meaning of Shemini Atzeret, the 8th day assembly, the last day of Sukkot, the 8th day. The earth has to continue on just a little while longer until Yeshua's fourth and final return at the time when the earth is burned up just prior to the white throne judgment. So if we rejoin the timeline now, we come to Revelation chapter 20 and verse 7. And it says, "Now when the 1,000 years have expired," so the millennium is done, "Satan will be released from his prison." Verse 8, "And he will go out to deceive the nations which are in the 4 corners of the earth." Now this, in context, it also means the 4 corners of the land of Israel, or basically in context, the Middle East and the north of Africa. That's what we're talking about, because the focal point is there in the land of Israel, and especially on Jerusalem and on the Temple Mount. So Satan will go out to deceive the nations which are in the 4 corners of the Middle East, essentially, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, whose number is as the sand of the sea. So now what we need to do is we need to know who is this Gog and Magog, because there's some conflicting requirements. We're going to see some requirements require him to be in the north, to the north of the land of Israel, and other requirements call for him to be all the way around the land of Israel in all 4 directions. So how does he get, who is this Gog and Magog, and how does he get to be both from the northern part and also be surrounding the land of Israel? So we do a word search for Gog and Magog, and we come to Genesis chapter 10 and verse 1 with the genealogy of Noah. So we see that Noah, or Noach actually in Hebrew, had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And effectively, Shem went east and into India and China, Japan, crossed the land bridge into the Americas. So your Native American peoples, most Latin Americans, they would all be basically Shemites. Then you have Ham, went south. The name Ham means hot, as in a hot climate. And then you have Japheth, who went to the north. So verse 2 tells us that the sons of Japheth, who went north, the name means expansive or expanding. It's also related to the word for beautiful. So the sons of Japheth were Gomer, which basically the Sumerian people, we'll see them again, and then Magog, along with some others that we see later on. But so we see this Genesis chapter 10 list of Magog, and then what we need to remember is that the prophecies are over Gog of the land of Magog. So the prophecies read a few different ways, but one of those ways is of the land of Magog. Now, if we take a look at the Hebrew meaning of the word Gog, it just means roof in Turkey. So again, if we start in the land of Israel, and then considering the Middle East, basically Turkey is the roof of Israel. It's the northern flank. And we'll see that word northern flank sometimes written as the farthest or uttermost parts of the north. It doesn't mean the uttermost parts of the north. It means the northern flank. And we should also, it's very important to note that Satan's seat, which we saw in earlier parts, Satan's seat in Pergamus is also there in Turkey. And it's specifically referred to. Some of the players in Ezekiel 38 show up. They come from this area. Also, Ezekiel 39, they come from this area, which is Pergamus in Turkey. Now, this is just like Yahweh has a temple, Satan also has a temple. Right now, his temple is on loan to in a museum in Berlin, but Turkey has requested the physical structure to come back. Now, we know that Islam is not always going to be a thing, because at the fall of Babylon, both the beast and the false prophet get cast into the lake of fire. So at that point, we don't see Islam as a player anymore, but we still see Gog. So what this tells us is that Gog is a physical reference to the same peoples who then become the Muslim peoples. But we're going to see a very high degree of correspondence between Gog and Magog and also the Muslim peoples. Now, we talked about the farthest sides of the north. If we come to Isaiah chapter 14, starting in verse 12, it says, "How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. How you are cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nations." It says, "For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of Elohim. I also will sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north." And that word in Hebrew, that phrase is Yerkate Tzafon, Tzafon meaning north. So there's this correlation between Japheth, who went north, one of the sons, and so the correlation to the north area, also the farthest flank of the north. So let's keep reading. We're doing some more research about who are Gog and Magog, and we're trying to figure out who they are. So we go to Wikipedia, of course, Wikipedia, and it says several things, but it says a legend was attached to Gog and Magog by the time of the Roman period, the two legs of iron, that the legendary gates of Alexander were erected by Alexander the Great to repel the tribe of Gog and Magog, effectively. So this is a legend that has to do, and there's a few different legends having to do with Alexander. So we're going to see a correlation between Alexander the Great and his Macedonian Empire, again, and this northern flank, and also the four corners of the Middle East that are referred to in Ezekiel 38. So as we saw earlier in part 8 of this video series, this is Alexander the Great's Macedonian Empire. Now, he conquered all this in 4 years, but let's start on the left. First, we have Rome. On the very left side of the image comes Rome. Now, notice the red line to the right of Rome. We talked about how Emperor Constantine's cousin, the Roman Emperor Diocletian, divided the administration of the empire into two parts in 293 CE because it had grown too big to be governable in the pre-electronic age. So Emperor Diocletian drew this administrative division, and at that time, it was literally called the eastern and the western legs of the Roman Empire, just like we see these two legs of iron in King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. But notice, now Alexander's empire, again, he conquered all this in 4 years, but it expanded through Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and even got up into Mongolia. And as we mentioned before in part 8, all of these areas are today Islamic. And then we also see there's been a lot of expansion up north of the Black Sea. And again, those are areas today where not only did Gog physically move into, but Islam also physically moved into, symbolizing that there could be a correlation between Gog and Magog and the Islamic people, just like there's other correlations in Scripture between the lost children of Ephraim and the Christians of today. So let's continue on in our research. In Gog and Magog, in Wikipedia, it also says, over Gog and Magog, it says, Romanized Jewish historian Josephus knew Gog and Magog, as the nation descended from Magog the Japhethite, as in Genesis, which we saw before, Genesis 10 and verse 2, and explained them to be the Scythians, which originally were in Iran, but again, they also expanded to that area north of the Black Sea. So there's another interesting quotation. It says, and I don't know, but it says, Gog and Magog appear in the Quran as Yajuj and Majuj, I don't know if that's right, adversaries of Dul Karnain, don't know if that's right, but it says Muslim geographers identified them at first with the Turkic tribes from Central Asia. So again, we've got Turkey, we've got the center of Alexander the Great's Greek or Macedonian swath, so to speak, which today is all Islamic. He says, and later they're identified also with the Mongols, again, which today there's a lot of Muslims in Mongolia. So the question then becomes, is Magog either the ancient people or an ancient people behind the Islamic world? Now we know that the black horse from the land of Israel, the black horse originally moved south into the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, and also you could say south in through Africa. But we also know that it expanded throughout the Turkic regions and then eastward from there, and that is where Magog, one of Japheth's sons, and we know that Japheth expanded to the north. So questions that we have, is the black horse primarily responsible for the spread of Islam to the south, and is the relation to Magog and all of the areas that Alexander the Great conquered, is that primarily responsible for the expansion of Islam to the north? Now, we don't know, but we do know that the Islamic world presently encircles all four corners of Israel. In other words, all four directions of the land of the Middle East, the known world at that time. And there's also a satanic Illuminati Masonic Lodge plan called the Coudenhove-Kalergi plan to expand Islam up into Christian Europe by importing Muslim migrants, so to speak. And then the plan is to cause unrest and collapse it. This is all in fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy in Daniel chapter 2. So there are so many things we don't know exactly about Gog and Magog, and we can't give direct proof, but there's some very interesting things that we need to see that are going to help us understand who it is operating in Ezekiel chapter 38. So if we take a look, now we know that Byzantium was then renamed Constantinople, and then today it's called Istanbul. It is in Turkey. It's in a very interesting region that is strategically situated or placed. It straddles between the Eastern and the Western worlds. And this is even one of the things they talk about Turkey, is what an interesting culture it is because it straddles both the Eastern and the Western worlds. Well, why does it straddle both the Eastern and the Western worlds? Well, we could consider that in 325 CE, the Emperor Constantine held the Council of Nicaea in Rome, but then in 330 CE, he moved the capital of the Roman Empire to Byzantium, built the city effectively from scratch as a planned city, and called it Constantinople. And one of his stated or given reasons for doing that was that Rome was so polluted with imagery and idolatry and sexual imagery, he wanted a city that was free of those things. So he decided to build a new one. Well, it then became effectively at one point, became the capital of the eastern leg of the Roman Empire. When the western leg, when Rome got sacked effectively, and before Rome was restored to preeminence, there was a period of time during which it was in Constantinople or Byzantium, however you prefer. So when we take a look at it, we've got Constantinople or Byzantium, and it has this progression of religions. At first, it is a Roman Catholic faith under Emperor Constantine. Then it became Greek Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox, and then today it's Muslim. But in the process of it becoming Muslim, effectively, the spiritual capital of the eastern leg had to get displaced. And this led to the rise of each nation in the eastern leg having its own, we've got the Eastern Orthodox Church. We've also got the Russian Orthodox Church, which is effectively Eastern Orthodox, except it takes the lead because it's Russia. And if we take a look at this with regards to King Nebuchadnezzar's dream statue, now remember, we've got the head of gold, which is Babylon, and we have the Babylonian rabbis dwelling there in their doctrine, which was created in Babylon, which is why they're still spiritually in the Babylonian exile, even though they're back in the land of Israel today. Then we've got the chest and arms of silver, Then we got the belly and thighs of bronze. And I don't want to use the term crotch, but not only is it belly and thighs, but there also we see then there is a bifurcation or a forking of the Roman Empire. We have the two legs of Rome. One is Eastern and one is Western, except today we have the 2 feet of iron mixed with miry clay. So we have the iron representing Rome, representing Christendom, and then we have the clay, which represents the Muslim world. And again, we've seen how that corresponds to Alexander the Great's empire. So we take a look at the eastern foot. Moscow is effectively the military head. Then you've got St. Petersburg as the financial capital with the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, although some question that perhaps China, if China continues to become Christian, it could also take a lead role financially. You've also got St. Petersburg operating in the sense of the spiritual capital of the Eastern Foot, although they do tend to defer to Rome and they do play into the ecumenical movement at some point. Now, it's interesting, the Eastern Foot, the pockets of miry clay are Shiite, especially with what are called the Shiite client states of Iran and then mainly Iraq. And then Syria is Alawite, but they're allied with the Shiites. And then you have in the Western Foot, you have the USA as the military power. You have the inner city of London acting as the financial power of not just the Western Foot, but it could be argued of the world effectively. And then you've got Rome as the spiritual power. So then there's also an allying with the Sunnis, but particularly Saudi Arabia and a few other nations in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. But notice the Eastern and the Western Foot are effectively divided and remain divided because of this bifurcation that happens in Turkey with Gog, with Alexander the Great's Macedonian Empire. That's where the split begins to occur spiritually. And it's very interesting because Turkey in particular, Byzantium, and we're also going to see that that is also where Satan's seat dwells, but Turkey suppresses what was Constantine's chosen capital for the Roman Empire. So again, they happen to sit astride this very important piece of ground, and they seem to serve as a link. This country in which the temple of Satan was built seems to serve as a link between the Eastern Babylonian Foot and the Western Babylonian Foot. So, and the Prime Minister or President Erdogan wants to restore the caliphate, which prior to this was located in Turkey. But this is not some meaningless effect. This is something for real. Let's take a look at current events. This is a headline from 2 or 3 days ago at the time of this filming. It's talking about, is Turkey at a crossroads between the U.S. F-35 fighter jet and a Russian S-400 surface-to-air missiles? But for reasons that no one is really quite able to explain, here we have this hostile Turkey, which is basically belligerent towards both Russia and the United States and Western Europe, makes all sorts of threats. They used they shot down Russian aircraft, and they rely both on the East and the West, but at the same time, they play both the East and the West off each other. And again, it is the land where Satan's temple was built. So here, let's come to rejoining the timeline. We've got Revelation chapter 20 and verse 8. It tells us that Satan is released from his prison, and then he will go out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, or the four corners of the land, or effectively the four corners of the Middle East, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, whose number is as the sand of the sea. And we're going to see in Ezekiel 38 in just a moment that it's a coalition of nations coming from all four directions. But in verse 9, it says, they went up on the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. And fire came down from Elohim out of heaven and devoured them. Now, there's a level of analysis called remez, which in Hebrew means a hint, or it's just basically a thematic correlation. But I can't prove this, but I tend to see a connection with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 19 and verse 24. Then Yahweh, meaning Yeshua, rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from Yahweh, meaning the Father, out of the heavens. So to me, there's very clear parallelism. There's remembering that the Torah is prophetic of coming events. We rejoin the timeline at Revelation chapter 20 and verse 8, and it says that when Satan is released from his prison, he will then go out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, or the four corners of the Middle East, Gog and Magog, including their coalition of nations, to gather them together to battle, whose number is as the sand of the sea. Now, again, this is we know the first war of Gog and Magog is coming in not that long. And this is the second war of Gog and Magog that comes at the end, but we know it's the same players. And again, if the players at the start of the millennium are the Muslim people, then what is the tie-in between the Muslim people and Gog and Magog? So continuing in the timeline, Revelation 20 and verse 9 says, they went up on the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. And fire came down from Elohim out of heaven and devoured them. So again, parallel language to Genesis 19 and verse 24. Continuing in verse 10, it says, the devil who deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, or already are. And they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. So we know that this is not the exact end of the history, because we know that just as the prophetic meaning or message of Shemini Atzeret at the Eighth Day Assembly, we know that the earth has to continue on just for a little while. We don't know exactly how long, but a little while it has to continue. And another reason we know this is in Ezekiel chapter 38 and verse 23, where Yahweh says, with this second war of Gog and Magog, he says, thus I will magnify myself and set myself apart, or sanctify myself. And I will be known in the eyes of many nations. And then they shall know that I am Yahweh. Well, if this is when the earth is burned up, is it the second war of Gog and Magog, then there's no opportunity for the nations to know that he is Yahweh, because the nations will be burned up. So because of this, we know that, again, as is indicated in Shemini Atzeret, the earth has to continue on a little while past the end of the seventh day, the seventh millennium, the 7,000 years. But we do eventually come to a point in time when Yeshua returns and the earth will then be burned up, just as it says in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 10, where we're told, but the day of Yahweh will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up at the brightness of his coming. And this is also what is reflected to his fourth and final coming, is what is the apostle Shaul refers to in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and starting in verse 15, where he says, for this we say to you by the word of Yahweh, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of Yahweh, meaning Yeshua, will by no means precede those who are asleep. And so this is as we've spoken about in the part about the rapture. Right now, those who are sleeping in the dust, they will be called up every time Yeshua comes to the earth. They will be taken with him. But those of us who are still alive, we have to wait until our body is transformed. Either we have to die and we return to the dust and then we go with Yeshua, or we have to wait until these bodies are transformed in the twinkling of an eye, when the earth is destroyed at Yeshua's return, fourth and final return. So continuing in verse 16, it says, for Yahweh himself, in other words, meaning Yeshua, will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of Elohim, and the dead in Messiah will rise first. It continues and he says, then we who are alive, so now the dead in Messiah, those who are sleeping in the dust, they're taken up. He says, then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet Yahweh, effectively Yeshua, in the air. And thus we shall always be with Yahweh. We will always, from that point forward, be with our husband, Yeshua. Where else would we be? Where else would you expect to find the bride? And this is the same thing the Apostle Shaul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, starting in verse 51, where he says, "Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed." So either we die and our body decomposes and we're changed now to all that's left is the spiritual body, or in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, when the earth is burned up, when the earth is destroyed. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed at the end of earth's history. And what a wonderful thing this is. How wonderful. I pray that Yahweh can help us all to understand that we will be changed. So no matter what happens to us during the time of the tribulation, no matter what happens during the trumpets or during the cups, it doesn't matter. If we are dwelling and abiding in him, if we are doing the right things, if we are abiding in him and he in us, then we have nothing to fear. So Revelation 20 and verse 11, then, when the earth is burned up, but the brightness of Yeshua is coming, it says, "Then I saw a great white throne, and him who sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them." Verse 12, "And I saw the dead, both small and great, standing before Elohim, and books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works, by the things which were written in the books." So one of the things that we see is that those who are written in the book of life have works. It's not just that we have knowledge. It's not just that we have intelligence. It's not just that we study scripture and read things on the internet, read studies. It's that we have works. Okay, continuing on, verse 13. "The sea gave up the dead who were in it. The death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them. And they were judged, each one according to his works." And when we get to the Torah government study, we're going to talk a lot more about the requirement of good works. We're saved by salvation, by grace through faith, and even that is not of our own doing. But yet we're judged according to our works. So works count. Works make a difference. Verse 14, it says, "Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire." This is the second death. In other words, there's no spiritual continuance. There's no spiritual life. He says, "And anyone not found written in the book of life," where the works are recorded, "was cast into the lake of fire." So what we've seen is that after the millennium is the second war of Gog and Magog. And even then, the earth continues on for a little while longer. We're not sure how long. And then the earth is burned up. The earth is destroyed at Yeshua's fourth and final coming. It's the final harpazo, the final lakach, the final taking. And then we all go to the white throne judgment. And then we will see in the next portion, we'll talk about how we go to the new earth. And we'll talk about a whole lot more. Thank you for joining me. Hope to see you again for part 18. Shalom.